Well, hi, everybody. It's nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Ashley and Chris. And I've actually had the pleasure of working with the National Pork Board and pork producers for the past 2.5 years, previously when I was at EY and now at Pollination. And so we've been working with the team at NPB to support the sustainability goals and metrics, and now we've been working on a range of research projects looking at different opportunities to fund some of these practices that Anne was just talking about. And so I'm going to talk to you today about one of the emerging opportunities that's getting a lot of attention in the climate finance space, and that is carbon markets. And so I work at a firm called Pollination. We're a climate change investment advisory firm. We're actually formed by some people who were former lawyers and really developed their career around climate change policy, particularly carbon markets as they were evolving in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so we've got a lot of people who have been thinking really hard about how to make carbon markets work for all the different stakeholders involved. And so we've been thinking about that in relation to how to make carbon markets work for pork producers in particular. And I'll just begin by kind of getting everyone on the same page with what a carbon credit is. We talked about this earlier a little bit. So units of greenhouse gas emissions, which include not just carbon dioxide, but also methane, as Anne mentioned earlier, and nitrous oxide, are measured and represented in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So even if we're measuring methane, we still convert it into tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it includes all of those gases. And for purposes of a carbon market, one carbon credit, which you've probably heard of, represents 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. And they're basically, carbon credits basically represent a certificate that indicates the emissions that have been reduced or removed compared to a baseline. And basically, we've seen a growth in carbon markets as a way to channel financing to reductions or removals of greenhouse gas emissions that wouldn't have occurred without that payment or without that finance. And so there's a few steps in generating a carbon credit. So sorry if people know this already. I'll just walk you through so everybody's on the same page. The first is that you have to understand for carbon markets, and we'll talk through some of the different players in the carbon markets in a minute, what activities are eligible to generate a carbon credit. And for the most part, there are a suite of activities for which there are methodologies or protocols that can be followed to generate an emissions reduction unit that can be then turned into a carbon credit. And I'll talk about some of those practices in a minute. But it's first important to understand what those eligible practices are. Then you register a project that's reduced emissions with a standards body or an aggregator or a project developer. And then you implement the activities. And it has any emissions reductions that are being generated for a carbon credit have to be verified, typically by a third-party verifier. That's really important for the integrity of the market. And then credits are issued and then sold on a registry for the most part. And there are some nuances here. So this is really focused on the voluntary carbon market, which we think of as the offset market, which many of you have probably heard of carbon offsets. But there's also, and I'll touch on this a little bit, there's also an emergence of what is being called carbon insetting. And that's where you generate emissions reductions and you might have a credit, but they're paid for by a company working within the agricultural value chain, or paid directly by a company to producers in their value chain. So that's a little bit different. This is kind of focused on the external market, especially when you sell credits on a registry. So just important to make that distinction. And they're both opportunities for producers to be compensated for their efforts to reduce emissions. So they're both important pathways, but we'll focus primarily on the carbon market today. So what are some of the practices that can generate carbon credits in the U.S. voluntary or compliance markets? So we have both voluntary markets and compliance markets. In the voluntary market in the U.S., there are a suite of activities that are relevant to producers that are considered appropriate for generating emissions reductions for the voluntary carbon market. And that includes reduced fertilizer application, which Ann was talking about, no-till, strip-till, or reduced tillage practices, planting of cover crops, rotation diversification, and any other practices that can increase soil organic carbon. And there are also activities that can generate carbon credits on the compliance market as well as in the voluntary market. And in the compliance market, improve manure management through methane capture and destruction, including through biodigesters, is also allowed. It's been much smaller than it has been. That's been a smaller amount of the market than it has been for dairy. Probably many of you are familiar with the fact that dairy producers are selling carbon credits on the California market, and that hasn't taken off as much in the swine industry. But that is, the swine industry is eligible to reduce emissions reductions through manure management on the compliance market. So sometimes these principles can be a little controversial, but I'm going to introduce them because they're pretty important with respect to the environmental integrity of the voluntary carbon market. So the voluntary carbon market is just that. It's not regulated by government. So it really relies on principles of integrity to ensure that it's going to work. And that means delivering benefits for the climate, but also for the other people involved in the long term. So the first principle is that greenhouse gas benefits, the emissions reductions, have to be real. So one credit has to represent 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent and be measurable. That's like the fundamental principle of the carbon markets. And they have to be additional. And a lot of people kind of debate this, and it can be challenging, I think especially challenging in working lands. You know, this principle really emerged from the forest carbon market, and it has been challenging in the agricultural sector. But nevertheless, the rationale behind it is that greenhouse gas benefits resulting from practices that have generated emission reductions should not have occurred without the program or without the payment. And the reason behind that is that we want to have some change for the climate. If we're just continuing business as usual, there won't be any reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the rationale behind that. I already mentioned that they have to be measurable, but they also have to be verified with approved methodologies and data. And then this is another principle that can get some pushback. It's also important that greenhouse gas emissions are durable, so they're going to last. They're not going to just, happen one year and then be reversed the next year. And we'll talk about how some of the different programs are navigating that. And then finally, they can't result in leakage. So if a practice is implemented in one place but to reduce emissions, but simply moves practices that cause emissions into another place, you really haven't reduced emissions overall. So you don't want to just displace activities to another location. And then the final principle that I don't have here is that only one entity can claim the reductions associated with emissions reductions. If multiple parties are claiming those reductions, then it doesn't really work out. And these principles are important, as I mentioned, for the market to actually deliver climate benefits, but it's also important from an economic perspective. If the market is viewed as fraudulent or not actually working, then people who are involved in it are not going to be paid a sufficient price, and it's not going to really last for that long. So it's important that these principles are adhered to for the most part. So forest carbon markets have been around for a while in the voluntary space, and agriculture has really taken off in the last few years or so within the voluntary carbon market. You can see in 2019, there was very, very little volume with respect to tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in the voluntary agricultural market. And in 2021, it went up by about 876% from 2020 to about 3.4 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. But it's still much lower than forestry and land use, renewable energy, or energy efficiency. But one of the reasons behind this jump is that there's an incredible increase in interest in nature-based sources of emissions reductions, particularly removals. And that's because there's increasingly attention on the fact that we can't just reduce emissions, we really need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that's where soil carbon comes in, and agricultural practices that we talked about a minute ago. But in addition, a lot of corporates, especially over the last few years, have made commitments to reduce their climate change emissions. And in particular, over 2,000 companies as of 2022 have committed to a climate change target through the Science Based Targets initiative. And that's a pretty robust process for setting a climate change target. And 90% of those companies have made supply chain targets as part of their, or Scope 3 emissions reduction targets, which are usually their supply chain targets, as part of their climate change goal. And so what that means is that they're going to have to reduce emissions within their supply chains. And the guidance from the Science Based Target Initiative is still evolving, but is encouraging companies to reduce emissions in their supply chain first before they offset from industries outside of their supply chain. And so I say that because I mentioned insetting a few minutes ago. Many people feel that that's going to drive a lot of corporate players more towards insetting and paying producers, for example, directly in their supply chain than purely going into the offset market. So just to share that's sort of an ongoing emerging development. So when you're engaging with a carbon market, there's different entities you can engage with. I'm going to start with the standards bodies, and these are typically, there's three dominant standards bodies: the Climate Action Reserve, the Verified Carbon Standard, and the American Carbon Registry. These are the dominant standard bodies in the US that have a registry system. And these are typically nonprofits, and they have basically developed because they've developed a long history of advancing and improving robust, peer-reviewed methodologies for practices that reduce emissions across agriculture, but other sectors as well. And they are viewed as supporting very high integrity credits. And so buyers on the voluntary carbon market tend to like credits that are issued on these registries because they're high integrity. They typically meet all those principles I mentioned earlier. And in some cases, because they're viewed as such high integrity bodies with respect to their methodologies, there are even some of the credits that they have on their registry are accepted in compliance markets as well. And the compliance markets, as you can imagine, could be even more rigorous than the voluntary markets. And because they establish registries, which means they basically put all the credits on a registry system where the credits can be tracked after they've been bought and sold, so we know who's generated the credit, who's bought the credit, and then the credit gets retired. So it can't be moved around and claimed by multiple people. But because they're put on a registry and they're tracked, they're accessed by a wide variety of corporate buyers. So if you generate a carbon credit and you put it on one of these registries, you can access a wide range of sector corporates or private sector investors or buyers from a range of different industries and geographies. And you can, as a producer, directly engage with these standard bodies. The challenge is that they require any entity that's going to generate an emission reduction credit that they want to put on this registry, you have to follow one of their methodologies. And you have to follow that methodology, do all of the analyses, the data, very similar to what Anne was describing. You can do that, but it can be very you can do your own kind of SEC-like analysis, but it can be very time-consuming and very expensive. And but the advantage is, if you go through that process and you put your credits on a registry, you have much more control over who buys your credits. So if you generate emissions reductions on your farm and you don't want a certain kind of company to buy your credits and claim credit for those emissions reductions, then you can choose who your credits go to. If you're basically in charge of the marketing, which you have to do if you put them on the registry yourself. And because the transaction costs associated with that, marketing your own credits and doing all of your own analyses are pretty high, this is probably an option for larger scale operations that have the resources to engage directly with a standard body. If you're a smaller or mid-size operation, you might want to go with a project developer or aggregator. And this is another pathway for selling your emissions reductions that you've generated on your farm. And so these are entities that have basically realized, wow, most people don't want to go through the hassle of collecting all their data, doing all the modeling, doing all the analysis, then trying to figure out who to sell the credits to. So these companies have basically created businesses around doing that for you. They will do all the analysis for you. They will then sell your credits on your behalf. And they can work with lots of small to mid-sized farms and large farms, but they aggregate lots of credits. And they can then put them on a registry. And one of the, and there's different kinds of project developers, which I'll tell you about. Some of them are aligned to a recognized standard, like one of these 3 standards. They follow the methods and the protocols that those 3 common standards have approved. And so they follow that methodology that's widely recognized by the market. And because of that, a lot of external buyers feel better about feel like those credits have higher integrity for the same reasons they would feel good about any credit on one of those registries I mentioned earlier. And actually the credits are put on those same registries. And because they're aligned with those standards bodies and those registries, they have to implement additionality and permanence considerations. However, because a lot of these groups that are developing in the agricultural carbon market recognize these additionality and permanence concerns are really challenging for producers, they are coming up with ways to try to get around that. So Indigo Ag, which many of you have probably heard of, is really the largest project developer that has aligned to one of these external standard bodies and registries. And so they are working to create a system that works better for agricultural producers than would be the case if we just took the rules from the forest carbon market and applied them to the agricultural market. So they are coming up with ways to help producers engage with the market and not have to comply with 100-year permanence restrictions, which some of the forest carbon markets require. And then there's some new market players that are emerging that have just created their own registries. And these are new players. Nori, which some of you may have heard of, and B Carbon have come up recently, and they are creating their own standards and methodologies. In both cases, they are trying to create systems that work better for agricultural producers, but they're in the early stages. And so they're less widespread right now, and they're not accepted in compliance markets. And we don't quite yet know what the pricing for their credits is going to look like over the long term because they're newer and because they're developing their own methodology. So that's just something to be aware of if you're trying to decide between these different programs. And then finally, there are some other programs that are developing that are more focused on either insetting or just helping producers that they work with sell their credits within agricultural value chains. And those include Cargill's program, which some of you may have heard of, the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, which I know a lot of people may have already worked with, and the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. And these are programs that utilize a lot of the aspects of like the Indigo Ag or the standard bodies kind of methodologies, but are taking a slightly different approach. They're dealing more directly with buyers in the agricultural sector rather than putting these credits on an external registry for anyone in the marketplace to buy. but in addition, they often have a more flexible approach around additionality and permanence because they're not aligning to those external standard bodies that I mentioned. And that could impact pricing because doesn't have exposure to the wider voluntary carbon market, but it could work in either direction because there can be direct negotiation with companies who want to reduce their emissions and are in the agricultural value chain and are willing to pay a reasonable price to do that to producers who are in their value chain and are reducing emissions. Cargill's actually using their program is actually helping them reduce emissions in their own supply chain by paying producers for tons of CO2 equivalent reduced using certain agronomic practices, but then they are also selling those credits to downstream customers as well. So they're using it to meet their own goals and their downstream customers' goals as well. So that's kind of an overview of all the different, some of the different programs that are out there and some of the different opportunities to engage. And there's really no right or wrong way to go. It really depends on your unique context, your unique production system. And so what we encourage is just to think about some of these different issues as you explore whether or not it's right for you to engage with a carbon market. And there's a few steps that we encourage kind of careful consideration. The first is project origination. I already mentioned it's important to understand what the eligible practices are for any program or project developer that you might consider engaging with. When the start date is, so these programs vary with respect to the baseline year from which practices could be implemented. So NORI, for example, will allow emissions reductions from practices that were implemented after 2010. Indigo Ag, though, is, I believe it's any practice implemented after harvest in 2020 can enroll for their 22 program. So there are very different start dates associated with these different programs. And they have different lengths of contract. So some programs may have a 1-year contract with producers. Others, it's often 5 years. So 5 years is actually not uncommon. And then they all have additionality requirements that might vary, as I mentioned a moment ago. And very important is the impact on engaging with a program, the impacts that might have on your own ability to make a claim about your emissions reductions. So some programs, especially if you're selling your credit within your own value chain or you're insetting, you can still, and some of these rules are still unfolding, but the understanding at this point is that you can still claim emissions reductions if it stays in your value chain. If you sell your carbon credit on an external market, then you are also selling the right to claim those emissions reductions. So if you own a farm and you've set a climate change goal and you're measuring progress and reporting on that progress towards your goal, if you sell a carbon credit to someone in the external market, you've also sold the right to claim that reduction, because remember, two entities cannot claim the same reduction. So that's something that a lot of people want to consider, because there can be benefits in holding on to that claim and marketing your pork as lower carbon pork, right? So you want to try to balance those two considerations. Secondly, when you're implementing the project, you want to think about the size. And some of these different programs have minimum size requirements. So, I know the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium has no size requirement for producers engaging in their program, whereas Rabobank, which is developing a pilot program, is going to target mid to very large size farms. So that's important to understand. And then finally, under implementation, it's important to think about the cost of implementing some of these practices and the timing of the finance. So, in some of these programs, they will pay up front. They'll pay you up front to help with implementation. In other cases, they'll only pay you after you've implemented the practices. So that's something to consider if you don't currently have the funding to implement cover crops, for example. But I will say one thing that's important to note is that programs like Indigo Ag and Ecosystem Service Marketplace Consortium allow you to also have other USDA or federal government funded programs like ICIP or the CSP program, but you can't engage with any other private sector carbon market program. So you can get funding to implement cover crops, for example, from like ICIP, for example, but if you're getting paid from some other private sector program, you can't use that money for implementation of your emissions reductions. Finally, there's verification, and as I mentioned, the monitoring requirements and costs can be really expensive if you're directly engaging with a standard body. And these project developers that I mentioned, whether it's Indigo Ag or NORI or B Carbon or Ecosystem Service Monitoring Consortium, all vary with respect to whether or not they make a producer pay for the monitoring and verification costs. And it's also important, they have differences on their data sharing and privacy policies, and that's a really important thing to look into. I know Indigo Ag they have their data privacy policy on their website, and some of the other programs do too, but it's important to understand what that is before engaging with any of these different projects. Then finally, it's important to understand how long you'll be expected to monitor and report on the implementation and maintenance of those practices. All of these different projects vary. And then finally, it's important to understand if you're selling the credits, if you're selling them directly, you'll have to directly negotiate the credit sales. But if you're selling through an intermediary, you want to consider what that price is, and they will vary. So most of them have a minimum price they'll pay, and some of them will give you a share of the upside. So Indigo Ag, for example, has a minimum price that they commit to pay, and if the price on the external carbon market goes up, they will share that upside with producers. So those are just some of the very different things to think about with these different programs. And again, there's no right or wrong answer or best program or worst program. It really depends on your own unique system. And then the final thing I'll add is that, and we've talked with Ashley about this a lot, is that carbon markets and engaging with carbon markets are really one of many different ways in which you can access financial incentives for implementing practices that reduce emissions or generate other positive environmental outcomes. And these are just a few different examples, but increasingly there is, an effort to look at climate risk adjusted loan rates, other kinds of insurance products that price premiums based on climate smart practices, and a whole range of other kinds of emerging finance mechanisms that are aiming to enable implementation of low carbon agricultural practices. So important to recognize they're but one part of a bigger basket of potential opportunities that are out there. And that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions. We've got a big team who's been working on these things, and always feel free to reach out by email if you have questions after today that come up. Great.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ingram. Good presentation. I certainly don't know anything about carbon markets, so I was very educated today on those. My question is price of corn is tied to the price of petroleum through the renewable fuel standards. You just talked about as the price of the carbon market would go up, that there would be some, the upside would be shared back with the generator of that carbon credit. What's the driving force to increase the carbon market? Is that also the price of fuel?
No, that's a great question. It's a great question. So what we've seen, it's really a supply-demand thing at the end of the day, as you probably know. What we've seen over the last few years, and the demand has grown tremendously for ag carbon credits in general, and actually nature-based credits. So right now it's about, I think, for nature-based offsets, it's about $9 per ton of CO2 equivalent. But that there was a boom in people seeking those nature-based credits, and what we've heard is that there's a shortage in supply of those credits, and so the expectation is that that price could continue to go up if demand continues to grow, and a lot of that demand is coming from the corporates I mentioned who are trying to meet their targets, and increasingly a lot of governments have also made commitments around integrating nature into their climate change targets, specifically agriculture. So, so it's probably going to be a demand supply thing, but also the price can also be really affected by the integrity of the market. And I think this is one thing people are a little bit worried about with the agricultural carbon market is how do we get the rules right so that they work for producers, but also keep the integrity of the market. And so that's part of the pricing as well. People are willing to pay a higher price right now for removals over reductions, and they'll pay a higher price for credits that they think are robust and have high integrity as well.
So this dovetails right into what you were just talking about. You mentioned earlier to maybe be careful about who purchases your credits. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? It sounds like there's lots of folks who want in on the ag nature-based credits. So what should a farmer producer be on the lookout for?
Excuse me. So what I meant to say, which I might have misspoken, was if you want to have control over who buys your credits, which I know from talking to some producers, that's really important. So I've heard from some producers they don't want their work to reduce emissions to go to some high-emitting company that then uses that to say that they're becoming climate neutral, for example. So if you want to have control over who buys your credits, then probably your best options are to directly engage with a standard body and put your credits on the registry and then develop your own marketing strategy. That's tough though, so typically bigger organizations are the ones who do that. Or to go through one of those programs that is primarily focused on the agricultural value chains and insetting, because they are going to sell within the ag sector. So your credit, your work to reduce emissions won't go to an oil and gas company or a tech company or a sector that's outside of the ag value chain. That's what I meant. And I know that may not be important to everyone, but some people who care about that, that's something to consider.
Yeah, I have a great example of that. I was flying, and I'm flying on Delta, and on the little TV monitor in front of us there, it says, Delta, carbon neutral since 2019. And I'm thinking about all of the kerosene that we've just burned to get off of the ground. I'm like, how can that be possible? That math is incredibly fuzzy. That's not even talking about the construction of that airliner itself. Like, I can understand, that's just for one airplane for Delta, right? I can understand, like, how they would be running out of carbon credits. I'm not sure there's enough forestry credits out there to just account for Delta, you know? So,
that's
and
what
again,
a lot of people are saying. Absolutely.
and again, be careful about who we sell our credits to, right? As an industry, we want to do the insetting rather than the offsetting, perhaps, right? More important to us. So, anyways, good advice.
Yeah, and actually, Chris, just to add to that, so no, it's a great point. And as I mentioned, earlier this year, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which has become the standard for corporate climate goal setting to provide rigor around that process and for monitoring progress. So it's harder these days to just put a goal out there and not do anything about it. If you're approved by the Science Based Target Initiative, you have to have interim targets. You can't just set a 2050 goal and not do anything between now and then. You have to have an interim target. But they released some draft guidance earlier this year focused on forestry, land, and agricultural use. And it's yet to come out as final. The final recommendations, to my knowledge, have not yet come out. But one of the proposals in that draft guidance was to not allow companies to meet their targets by buying offsets outside of their value chain. So they have to prioritize reductions first to meet their science-based target. And that's a really important principle so that we don't just have everyone displacing their emissions elsewhere. And we'll probably drive more of that insetting that I mentioned. Yep.
I think you were hitting on this earlier, but it was important, the point you brought up about the risk of double counting and then the inability to cross-claim, and including whether you've got offset or inset markets. And so it might be helpful to illustrate with an example. Like if a swine producer ultimately ends up putting in a biodigester on the lagoon and selling biogas to the California market, meanwhile, if their hogs ultimately end up getting slaughtered by a company that's made an SBTI commitment and or wants to market low-carbon bacon, who gets to claim the credit? I think your point is that the processor can't claim those anymore. So if you've entered into a 10-year contract with anybody, for wherever your credits are going, if that's not tied with whomever actually ultimately processes your hogs, then your credits are sort of out of reach for them or off limits, right?
That's
I think
right.
that's the point.
You can't claim those credits twice. Exactly. And that's why I think it's important to think through, like, where is it going to be most beneficial? Like, am I going to get paid more for having lower carbon pork? Yeah, or am I going to get paid more from the compliance market in California? So again, really important to think about those different issues. Yep.
Yeah, just to put everything kind of perspective, man, I picked up this sheet here,
Yes.
right? And soil carbon sequestered 0.3 tons per acre, okay? And I think you just threw out the number of $9 a ton carbon credit.
Mm-hmm. For average for nature-based offsets.
Yeah, so whatever, right? Mm-hmm. So we're looking at basically $2.50 per acre for implementing a program and a contract. I'm sorry, but that's a very small number.
Yeah.
In comparison, in relative to everything else.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and that's one of the things with the voluntary carbon market, the price will go up and down. And that was just today. I just looked right before the presentation, like what the price was today. So it could vary. And this is why, in some cases, it can be advantageous to go with one of these project developers that offer a minimum price, and they guarantee a minimum price. So Indigo Ag, for example, or some of them will say, we guarantee if you do these, we'll give you a minimum price. And they're aggregating so many credits and kind of viewing this over the long term that's part of their business model to get more people enrolled. But if you're going directly to the market through one of those standards bodies, you're going to be more exposed to those fluctuations. And so that's something you'd want to consider. If that might not be good economics.
My point is $3. You know, your cost of production at $500 an acre for corn, right? $3 is not going to do anything. That didn't even touch the seed.
Right. Right. Yeah. But I think that's really important to consider when you're weighing these different options, is to think through those things and to understand what the implications are with going with different programs too.
Well, thank you, Carter. I had one final quiz. I thought you were going to take my quiz question, but you ended up going a different direction. So thinking about the report and thinking about that number, even if it was a much higher number, right? So that let's put it in the equals $20 an acre, maybe, right? Is that report, would that be a carbon credit? Yes or no? Any guess? Exactly. Okay, so that's correct. It is not showing you a carbon credit. So there's not one answer here. There's multiple answers here. Does anybody want to throw out a reason why is that report not necessarily showing a carbon credit? Go ahead. Anybody? So it didn't follow the right a methodology of a carbon credit, right? Didn't a specific one. Also, and additionality, right? This is it. That was everything that's currently on the ground now, not an additional practice then going forward with the start date and everything that Carter talked about. So that's probably one of the biggest questions I get about the reports is, so this is a carbon credit. And so simple answer is no. There's a lot of reasons of why it isn't. But at the same time, one of the things National Pork Board has realized is that is the question we're getting a lot of, and how can we help producers kind of wade through these questions. And so that's why we have worked with Pollination to create a white paper that kind of goes through a lot of what Dr. Ingram has talked about. And then two, kind of working with SEC to say, how can we look at those different methodologies and give producers more guidance? If they work with Dale already on the report and he says, I'm really interested in figuring out which program I might be best suited for, they can provide some of that service. So so there are these opportunities, right? And we're constantly looking about how, so similar to Dr. Hostetler's question for everybody of how can we make these, how can we utilize these reports? Ultimately, we want to be able to pull all the data together and have that national level story. But we equally, or if not more important, to get that national story, we have to make it valuable for Dale. He has to be able to utilize it, and the best scenario we can make is that it makes it profitable. It adds to his bottom line, and it doesn't just take away his time. So we'll continue to do that. Appreciate everybody here kind of working towards that with us. As you have more questions about them, if you're talking to clients or you yourself are more interested in them, feel free to give me a call. I'm sure Ann would be happy to talk to you as well, but I'll be around for at least a whole nother day, and we can talk about whatever it is you'd like to talk about. But thank you for being here today. Appreciate it very much. Appreciate your participation. Hope you guys have a great rest of Leman's conference. Yes, Pedro?
Just for everybody to remember, when you fill out the surveys for the Leman conference, make a comment whether this was useful and whether you would like to see it next year, or what form or shape or what would be beneficial for next year. We've done these in sessions or other years, and now we have this a little bit different as a workshop, which personally I think was very useful to have these interactions. But think of, since it's fresh today, what would you think of doing next year, right? And if it was useful, and what would be a benefit?
Yeah.
Make sense?
Yeah. Great ad. And thank you, Dr. Hostetler, for organizing all of this.
I thought Pedro was going to advertise for bacon and beer.
That's right. That was on my list. Bacon and beer, nothing better. All right. Well, thank you guys. Have a great